They saw him that evening, not as a man in a hurry, but as a man listening. The general walked along the narrow road that led away from headquarters to a low hill, and beyond, to a field where the forest line darkened on the horizon. There were no shouts, no bustle. The wind rustled the dry stems, the occasional bird called from the thicket, and the sound of his footsteps faded into the soft earth. He wore a uniform, neat down to the last button, and the thin piping on his cap gleamed. But there was something in the way he held his head, slightly lowered, with a hint of thoughtfulness, that was immediately memorable. It was as if he carried within himself a silence that could not be shared with anyone else. During the day, he held several short conversations, without harsh remarks or paperwork. His aide would later say that the general looked out the window much more often than usual, as if measuring the distance between this day and something invisible beyond. On the table lay maps, pencil lines, a small notebook with dates and names. But the strangest thing was that everything remained in its place, as if he had no intention of leaving. Gloves neatly folded in a drawer, a raincoat on the back of a chair, a metal box with glasses on the windowsill. He was not a man of impulse. If he were leaving, he would pack his things. If he were changing his plan, he would leave instructions. But nothing of the sort happened. He emerged toward evening. The officers who accompanied him to the porch exchanged brief glances, a nod of, as it should be, a soft, everything is fine, on the adjutant's lips. The general smiled, but the smile was narrow, like a slit of light on the threshold. He didn't take his cloak, though a haze was already gathering on the horizon. He carried only his cane, not as a support, but as a habitual part of his gait. He rarely used it. Sometimes he tapped the stone when he was thinking, but now the cane lay unnoticed in his palm, like a finger of memory. The road from headquarters wound through low bushes, shimmering with small stones, and led to a one-story chapel built on the slope of a hill. The chapel was old, its whitewashed walls cracked in several places, and dark patches of moss clung to the roof. Nearby stood a stone bench, smooth from hands and rain. He had been seen at this bench. He stopped, placed his cane beside him, and rested his hand on the edge, as if listening to something underground. The rumor of this moment would live longer than any other detail, because there was nothing decisive about it, only a pause. Soldiers later recalled that he loved such places, quiet, without any special significance for outsiders, but with a silence that felt like a refuge. He said that beyond the village, just beyond the field, there was an old stream where the water seemed to flow slower than time. He wasn't given to metaphors, but these words sounded as if they had been imprinted in his voice for a long time, and were only now finding their way out. That night, the square in front of headquarters was empty. The duty officer lit the lamps in the corridors, closed the windows, and checked the seal on the archive room doors. The shift cleared their throats, and conversations were hushed. Nothing foreshadowed any unusual turn of events. No signal, no message, no visit. The rooms smelled of paper and wood, and files lay neatly stacked on the desks. The clock on the wall showed 5 to 10. The general usually returned at that time. That night, he didn't. It's not as if his absence was immediately noticed. Sometimes he'd linger, a stroll, a quick letter, a chat with a peasant at the gate. But closer to midnight, the adjutant finally stepped out onto the porch, peered into the darkness as far as the lantern's light allowed, and quietly said, "Strange." He was met by a silence in which every footstep could have been heard had it been someone else's. Degrees of anxiety in such places are measured not by volume, but by the absence of the usual rhythm. The usual rhythm, footsteps toward the door, cane on stone, voices. That night, there was no rhythm. The morning arrived cold, frost on the windows, crisp grains of ice on the grass. The general's cap lay on the chair, just as it had that evening. In his notebook, yesterday's date and a name underlined with a thin line. The name of a village, across the field. Someone would say they were planning a visit, but wouldn't say to whom. The to whom would remain a blank space on the line. In his neatness, this blank space almost looks like a sign. In front of the hill where the chapel stood, the ground was soft, as if it had been recently touched. Leaves rose and fell in a light breeze, and a light trace remained on one of the stones near the bench. fine dust, as if from a shoe. The bag under the stone held nothing.
Everything in the chapel was as usual.
Candles, a thin thread of cobweb on the wall, an empty wooden donation box in the corner. The person who had come here that evening had left no trace of their hand, no fingerprint on the lamp glass, if they had. In contrast to this clarity is his desk. On it, next to the maps, lay a leather glove case, empty. The gloves were in a drawer. His glasses were in a metal box. He hadn't taken anything he might need for the journey. No coat, no glasses, no gloves, only his cane. And it's unclear whether he returned it to his hands when he rose from the bench. On the windowsill sat a small box of thin rubber bands, one of which was stretched out, lying half on the table, half dangling. Such detail sometimes seems superfluous, but in disappearance stories it can be a crutch. What would relieve tension on any other day suddenly becomes the end here. The officer who saw him walk toward the hill described his gait as even, unhurried, and without strain. There was nothing to indicate haste or intent to escape. The scene, if the words were to be believed, was almost tranquil.
The emptiness set in later,
when the calm didn't return with the familiar echo of the door. The village beyond the field didn't sleep for long. People outside by the well told stories of how the general sometimes helped the local teacher with maps. He'd laugh at how north was the wrong way from the window. The teacher loved to rearrange the desks in the classroom, searching for the right beam of light. The general stopped by twice, once during the day, once late in the evening. Both times he didn't stay long. Everyone who cared knew this. He was a man of schedules. So his disappearance, which began between the hill and the field, seemed like a violation of the inner pact he'd made with himself. There's an oddity that's still talked about today. That evening, when he stopped by the bench, someone walking along the lower path heard footsteps not on the ground, but as if on a stone floor. The steps were clear, measured, as if in a corridor. In the field, there are no corridors. There are no flagstones. Such a sound doesn't happen here. And yet the witness, a simple man, not given to fantasies, claimed. The sound was as if in a building. This phenomenon selects rare ears, because in ordinary silence it's easy to confuse a branch with heavy footsteps. The assertion lived on, growing with disbelief, but did not disappear completely. A whole line of stories would later be built on this oddity, about a secret gallery, about an underground passage, about a room from which you can hear running water. But on the first day, when the facts are still clear and bright, such lines look like smoke from a fire that no one lit. The headquarters responded according to the rules, but without unnecessary harshness. They checked the surrounding road and noted the route he had been seen on. They found no trace of him from the chapel, not even any footprints that would lead him to the forest. At the edge of the field, there was a thin row of boot prints, but that wasn't the size of the field. The tracks led to a barn where hay was stored. No new stories emerged there. The hay smelled of last summer. Inside it was empty. On the shelf, a nail. On the nail, nothing. The sun rose quietly. The shadows on the ground lengthened, and it seemed as if the hill's elongated shadow covered part of the road like a lid. If he had returned, he would have been seen immediately. By midday, it became obvious. He hadn't moved in any direction so as to be noticed. He hadn't removed himself from the line of sight, but seemed to have remained there the entire time, and yet simultaneously vanished. This contradiction is the whole strangeness. There's another detail. In his notebook, next to the date of yesterday, there was a small mark, a square with a thin diagonal line drawn through it. He rarely made such a mark, usually when it came to architecture, houses, bridges, old buildings. He had a particular interest in stable things. He didn't like to talk about events. He preferred to talk about the forms that hold them together. The square, like his forgotten idea of stability, suddenly surfaced alongside its disappearance. And this, too, became attached to a mysterious meaning in subsequent retellings. He went to the stable. Although those who saw it won't say where, they lived the day as they do when one person is missing. The one they're waiting for to return, and in the apparent ordinariness, their attention grew on objects, a cane, a bench, a box of glasses, a square in a notebook. These quiet things became the framework of conversation, without alarm, without limitations, only a pure attempt to understand. By evening, the haze had risen again. The chapel stood out white against the hill, as if painted with a lighter color than it actually was. The stone bench was bare, except for tiny marks etched into the surface, traces of time, traces of the people who had sat there. On a shelf in the chapel stood a pair of unlit candles. On the wall was a stain, exactly where a photograph had once hung. The photograph was long gone. No one remembered what it had held, but the void on the wall looked like a neat place for remembrance. The general was not seen again that day. The story of his disappearance began with a clear outline: a road, a hill, a chapel, and then silence. There were no loud orders, no anxious gatherings, only a routine, gently shifted from its usual center, and a glance out into the field, as in the first half of a sentence that had fallen silent. This disappearance had no abrupt gesture. There was a feeling he had entered a space that abhorred evidence, like a man entering a room where everything is in place and suddenly realizing the door hadn't closed behind him but had vanished. In every such story, there remains an element upon which the subsequent search is built. In our case, it's the chapel. It will become the axis. Roots will approach it, clues will be sought in it, a transition will be attributed to it. But in the first chapter, where there are no definitive theories or documentary evidence, the chapel simply stands on the slope, raising its white wall against the soft haze of evening. And if you stare at it long enough, you can hear not a bell, but footsteps on a stone floor, the very same ones someone heard on the trail. There are no stone floors in the field, but sometimes stories choose sound before they choose fact. And then, the first chapter ends where the sound remains, but the person does not. The morning began with the usual routine. The lamps were lit at headquarters, the officers checked their documents, and the duty officer noted the wake-up time in the log. Everything looked as if the day promised to be ordinary, but it was precisely in this ordinariness that the first crack appeared. The general was absent from breakfast. At first, this didn't cause alarm. He often preferred solitude, lingering in his study or going for a short walk. But when the clock rolled past 9 and his chair remained empty, an adjutant came up to his room. The door was ajar. Inside, everything was orderly, almost museum-like quiet. Maps lay neatly stacked on the table. A metal case containing his glasses rested on the windowsill. A cloak hung over the back of a chair. Everything was in place, too much in place. The adjutant noticed something odd. Yesterday's date was underlined in his notebook, and next to it was the same square with the diagonal line. But there were no notes about plans, no instructions. It was as if he'd left a symbol instead of words. By midday, it became clear. He was nowhere to be found, neither at headquarters, nor in the village, nor on the road to the forest. The soldiers sent out to search for him returned empty-handed. Even the dogs, who had picked up the scent at the porch, lost it at the foot of the hill where the old chapel stood, where he had last been seen the previous evening. The chapel was empty. On the stone bench lay only a thin layer of dust and the mark of a cane, as if its tip had left a slight dent. But neither the cane itself nor the person. Inside, everything was as usual. Candles, a cobweb in the corner, a wooden offering box. Not the slightest hint that anyone had been here during the night. The officers began to speculate. Some said he could have gone voluntarily, leaving everything behind. Others said he was taken away secretly. But then why were all his personal belongings left behind? The strangest thing was precisely this, a disappearance without a trace, but also without preparation. By evening, the anxiety had become palpable. The headquarters was silent, broken only by the scratching of pens and footsteps in the hallway. Everyone expected the door to swing open and him to enter, as always, with a slight smile and cane in hand. But the door remained closed. His absence had also been noticed in the village. The old men at the well were chatting. We saw him yesterday at the chapel. He was standing there, as if listening to the earth. Someone claimed to have heard footsteps in the fog, but the steps were strange, not on the ground, but as if on a stone floor. The night brought even more questions. At headquarters, they checked all the documents, all the archives. Nothing was missing. Even the personal letters he kept in a drawer were still there. It was as if he'd left empty-handed, without a past or a future. Thus began the story of his disappearance, not with a loud event, not with an alarm, but with silence, with an empty chair, neatly folded maps, and a cloak slung over the back of it, with a chapel where the tracks ended, and a road that led nowhere. And the longer the day wore on, the clearer it became. The general hadn't simply left. He'd vanished, the way things disappear when they refuse to be found.
Got it, Ivan.
You're right. The story of a disappearance should read like a coherent documentary, not a report with subheadings. Let me rewrite the third chapter in the same style as the first two, a coherent narrative with atmosphere and detail. When it became clear that the general had not returned by morning or midday, a silence fell over headquarters, like someone awaiting a thunderstorm. No one uttered the word missing, but everyone understood that his absence was no longer a coincidence. The adjutant, pale and tired, gathered several soldiers and led them along the road to the hill. Where the general had last been seen yesterday, the ground was damp with dew, but no trace remained. Only a barely noticeable dent was visible on a stone bench near the chapel, as if the tip of a cane had left a slight mark. The soldiers circled the chapel. Inside, everything was as usual. Candles, a cobweb in the corner, an empty donation box. Not the slightest hint that anyone had been there during the night. The dogs brought in later picked up the scent near headquarters, but lost it at the foot of the hill. It was as if someone had reached the chapel and vanished. The search continued into the forest. The soldiers combed trails, peered into ravines, and checked abandoned barns. But everything was empty. In the village the road led to, the residents merely shook their heads. We haven't seen him. An old teacher, with whom the general occasionally conversed, said he had been expecting him the previous evening, but he never showed up. By evening, rumors began to circulate. One soldier claimed to have seen a uniformed figure near the chapel after sunset, as if the general was standing in the doorway, looking toward the forest. Another said he heard footsteps in an abandoned estate nearby, although the building had long been empty. But none of these stories were confirmed. At headquarters, they checked all the documents, all the archives. Nothing was missing. Even personal letters were still there. It was as if he'd left lightly, without a past or a future. This oddity only heightened the anxiety, disappearing without a trace, but also without preparation.
The night brought even more questions.
Footsteps in the hallways sounded too loud. The lamps burned longer than usual. Everyone expected the door to swing open and him to enter, as always, with a slight smile and a cane in hand. But the door remained closed. So the search, which had begun with the certainty that the general would soon be found, turned into a silent admission. He had disappeared. Not escaped, not taken by force, but vanished, the way things vanish when they refuse to be found. At first, the silence seemed part of the job. Not all disappearances are noisy. Many simply pause. At headquarters, people spoke in hushed tones. In the village by the well, the whispers were as even and calm as water in a bucket. But the days piled up like sheets of paper, and each new day increasingly tested the patience of those accustomed to believing in facts. Facts didn't multiply. Instead, the whispers increased, a delicate web of words, each word tugging at the next and pulling it toward conjecture. The first to speak was the old man who lived in the house below the hill. He had climbed up to the chapel that evening to check for a forgotten candle and stopped by a stone bench. The grass around it was slightly flattened, as if someone had passed slowly, unhurriedly. The old man spoke slowly, as one might speak of things that don't need extra shine. There were footsteps, but the sound wasn't right. Not like walking on the ground, like walking along a strip of stone, long and narrow. He pointed to where the path descended. "But there's no stone there," they replied. The old man nodded and added, "Yes, no, but that's how it sounded." His words were not contradicted. They were simply placed nearby, like an object placed on a table. Let it lie there, in case it comes in handy. The following week, a woman from the village was returning from the well, carrying a bucket, and in the foggy whiteness, she saw a figure near the monastery walls. Nothing alarming, just the silhouette of a man in uniform. He stood very calmly, as if waiting for the day to end. She walked around the stairs, climbed the stone, but found no one where the figure had stood. "Maybe it's the fog," she said to her neighbors that evening, her voice quiet, without any desire to convince. but one of the women replied, "He was standing too still. The fog doesn't do that." The soldiers assigned to night patrols also began to notice oddities that weren't usually recorded in reports. One said he heard a familiar melody, a quiet whistle, calm, almost like the sound of someone walking and thinking about something. The general sometimes whistled like that as he walked down the corridor, and those serving nearby knew the music as they knew the rhythm of their superior's footsteps. Another swore he saw a faint light in the window of an abandoned manor house that had stood empty for several years. The light was more like the glimmer of light from a pane of glass, but the glass had long since been removed. The frames shattered. "Maybe the moon," said a third. "Maybe a lamp," added the first. They didn't argue, because the night didn't like arguments. The night loved silence and repeating roots, where each new sound formed a small personal story. The chapel gradually became a nexus for these stories. Its white wall, slightly rough and cracked, looked like a sheet of paper on which someone constantly writes words and then erases them. The stone bench held the memory in its physical form, a smooth surface, warm at midday and cool in the evening, with tiny dents, one for every person who had ever sat to listen to the silence. In this silence, people began to speculate. Someone said there was an empty passage beneath the chapel, not a corridor in the strict sense, but a slight cavity in the earth, thin and elongated, like a seam. "If you walk over it, the sound changes," said a man who studied the old foundations. "The sound has become stone," repeated an old man from the house below the hill. And at that moment, two different stories merged into a single line, none the less true. One day, a peasant working near the monastery fence found a small copper token on a rock. On its side were initials, like the ones the general wore. The token was worn, softly dull, like things often held in the hand. It lay right there, where yesterday there had been nothing. First, they picked it up with 2 fingers, like a thin sheet of paper with an important, discreet note on it. Then they brushed the dust off, laid it on a cloth, and showed it to the adjutant. He stared at it for a long time, then said, "It looks like it," and then repeated, "It looks like it." The word added nothing, but it quickly entered conversations, as if attached to already prepared sentences. They found a sign. He left a mark. "This is the way." The token proved to be a small center around which a new spiral of words began to spin. Some gravitated toward chance, others toward intention. People began visiting the old estate more frequently, not because they expected to see anyone there, but because the faint light someone had seen in its window seemed like an invitation to investigate. The estate stood empty. The rooms smelled of wood dust. The steps of the staircase sagged softly, like the fabric of an old carpet. In one of the halls, a thin streak of fine dust was found on the windowsill, spreading slightly wider at the end, as if someone had traced it with a finger and stopped. This trace had no obvious meaning, but it, like the token, lay on the table next to other things that perhaps meant more than they seemed. Every morning in the village began the same way. Bread, water, a brief exchange of news, and each time the topic returned to the chapel. A girl with blonde hair and a calm gaze once said that she had dreamed of a man in uniform. He stood by the wall, looking not at her, but at the door. In her dream, he was neither menacing nor kind, simply attentive. He was waiting, the girl said, and the word held more simplicity than any adult explanation. The dream remained a dream. But its story was also placed alongside, because sometimes it is simplicity that defines the dimension of time. Something waiting means it has not completely disappeared. The headquarters maintained a strict line. Words like shadow, light, and steps on stone never appeared in the papers. The papers contained roots and times, names and places, but something soft like air still crept between the lines. Anticipation. Everyone felt it. The duty officer listening in the corridor, the soldier at his post, the woman at the well. It seemed as if the vanished person remained not as a body, but as a routine that continued without its master. The evening space seemed to produce a familiar rhythm, the rustle of paper, the tap of a cane, a soft melody. And when this rhythm didn't come, the air itself reminded them of it, reproducing it without a source. Another object was found, A small pin, the kind sewn to the inside of a cloak to hold the lining in place. It was discovered on the road leading from the hill to the field, next to a thin line of grass, flattened as if by a careful step. The pin was closed, without fabric, clean.
Could be anyone.
Said the man who picked it up, but he still gave it to headquarters. The pin proved no one's thoughts.
However,
Words began to ripple from it again, like ripples on water. Took off his cloak. Was without his cloak, left a mark. The words didn't confirm each other, but they easily clung to the familiar. That's how absence works. It attracts light objects and makes them parts of the structure. The rumors weren't confined to the night and weren't confined to the fog. One young soldier said that on a clear afternoon he'd heard a faint ringing sound on the hill, as if someone had run a finger across glass. There's no glass on the hill. There's grass, stone, and air, and the ringing lingered in his ears, longer than the sound of a bird. Another soldier reported that in the headquarters hallway, next to the general's office door, he'd caught the scent of the same polish used to polish his cane. But the cane's gone, he said, his gaze not bewildered, but rather attentive, as if the scent had imprinted a mark in the room, replacing a presence. The voices didn't clash. Every boot, every gesture, every crack in the wall took on more meaning these days than it usually might have. No one claimed to know. No one named the place where the man had gone. But a subtle agreement emerged in the conversations. The disappearance at the edge of the chapel wasn't simply the end of a journey. It was like being transported to another dimension of the same space, as if the road leading to the hill wasn't the only one, and there was another, narrow, invisible to the eye, but audible to the ear at a certain hour. The monastery walls they spoke of were strong. Old objects, nails, pieces of glass, buttons, were sometimes found in their masonry. People doing renovations said there was a void behind the plaster on the inside of one of the bays. Not a corridor, not a hiding place, just a light space where the air sounds different when you knock on it. They often built it like that, they said, to soften the weight. But in the days when the disappearance was fresh, the void behind the plaster acquired a new dimension. It became a place where silence could retreat when it felt too cramped outside. And another story, cautious as a step in the twilight. One night when the guards were being relieved, one of the soldiers stopped at the chapel door and, suddenly falling silent, heard the faint scraping of wood against stone inside. The sound was soft, brief, like someone moving a box or leaning on a bench. The soldier didn't enter. He stood there until the shift was relieved, then left, saying nothing to anyone until morning. In the morning, when he spoke, he didn't try to pronounce the words. His voice simply said, "I heard." There were no fresh traces in that chapel, but the memory of sound lives differently than the memory of a drawing on the ground. It lasts longer if it was heard by someone who knows how to stand silently. Thus the first rumors were born. They didn't scream. They didn't seek to explain. They added small details to the void so that the void would no longer be absolute. And over time, it was precisely these details that began to form a new type of presence. The missing person was seen and heard as a sequence of signs: a faint dent in a stone, a token on a bench, the sound of footsteps not on the ground, a thin streak of dust on a windowsill, the smell of polish in the hallway, a pin in the grass, a faint ringing sound on the hill, a rustling sound in wood inside the chapel. And the more such signs appeared, the more the story veered from documentary lines toward legend, without losing its inner precision. In the village, a woman said one night, looking at the monastery walls, "He's comfortable here, even without us." It was a strange way to describe a person, as someone comfortable near a stone. But someone heard her and repeated her words. The words settled into place where a legend begins to grow. A legend doesn't negate facts. It carefully folds them like neat things in a box. And then, when the time comes to open the box, the things turn out not to be evidence, but signs that someone was here, even if they weren't seen. By the end of the month, it became clear that the rumors wouldn't disappear, just as the reflection of a tree by the river doesn't vanish, even when the tree itself is far away. They weren't trying to replace the search. They were doing something else, holding the space of silence in place so that it wouldn't disintegrate. The chapel stood in its place. The hill hill gently raised the road. The monastery walls breathed dry air, and in this scene, where every object knew itself, the feeling gradually took hold. The general hadn't completely abandoned it. He'd retreated to a lower layer, not down or up, closer. And sometimes, when a shadow lay on a stone in the twilight, it seemed not from a tree, but from a man in no hurry to return, yet still able to stand erect, as if at the entrance to his office. Years passed. The general's disappearance gradually ceased to be a topic of daily conversation, but it never faded from memory. It became part of the local air, like the smell of dampness in old walls, or the ringing of a bell, audible even when silent. People moved on, but every time they passed the chapel or the monastery walls, they involuntarily recalled that evening when the man in uniform disappeared into the fog and never returned. Time took its toll. The headquarters had long since emptied, the officers had departed, and the soldiers had returned to civilian life. But the monastery, standing nearby, still preserved its walls. Its restoration began at a later time, when the war had become a thing of books and memories. Masons tore away old plaster, carpenters replaced beams, and every hammer blow echoed, as if the walls themselves were remembering the past. It was then, during these works, that the discovery occurred. In one of the side walls, behind a layer of mortar and brick, a void was discovered. At first, they thought it was a simple construction gap left to facilitate the masonry, but when the stone was removed, a small hiding place was revealed. It contained a leather glove box, darkened by age but still sturdy. On the lid were initials, the very same ones that belonged to the general. A thin notebook was found next to the case. The paper was yellowed, the ink was smudged in places, but the words were legible, and the strangest thing was, the handwriting didn't match his. The notebook contained notes clearly written by someone else. The entries began several days after the general's disappearance. They mentioned places and events he couldn't have known about. They described conversations, meetings, even dates that occurred after he was no longer seen. The restorers read the first page aloud. He came here at night, sat on the bench, listened to the walls. Then he left the case, said, "This is a sign," and went where no door leads. These words sounded as if they were written by a witness. But who could be a witness if no one had officially seen him after that evening? The entries grew even stranger. They mentioned the names of people known in the village, but who had died long before the war. They included dates that coincided with days when footsteps were heard, or a silhouette was seen in the chapel. It was as if the diary were recording not events, but echoes of events, their shadows. On the last page there was a short phrase, "He has not left, he is waiting." This discovery sparked a wave of new speculation. Some said the general had indeed left the sign, others that someone had deliberately planted the items to support the legend. But how to explain the coincidences in the notes? How to explain the initials on the case? A token once found near the chapel now formed a chain with this discovery. Rumors, footsteps, the smell of polish, the sound of a cane. All of it suddenly acquired a new focus. The hiding place in the wall became proof that the disappearance was not a simple disappearance. It was a transition. From then on, the monastery ceased to be just an old building. It became a place where people came not only for prayer or silence, but also to touch a mystery. People would approach the wall where they had found the case and notebook and place their palms on the stone, as if hoping to hear the footsteps they had once heard on the stone floor. And every time, on foggy evenings, a shadow appeared near the walls, no one asked, "Who is it?" Everyone knew that the answer had long been given. The notebook found in the monastery wall became the subject of much debate. Its pages smelled of damp and lime. The ink had run in places, but the lines were still legible. And the more they were read, the stronger the feeling became that these were not just notes, but something more, a reflection of something that defied conventional boundaries. The first entry was dated the same day as the general's disappearance, but it wasn't written in his handwriting. The handwriting was uneven, as if the writer had been in a hurry or writing in the dark. The lines read, "He came at night, sat by the wall, listened to the stone breathe, said he was leaving a mark. Then he vanished into the silence." These words sounded like testimony, but who could be a witness if no one had officially seen him after that evening? The entries then became even stranger. They mentioned events that occurred after his disappearance. For example, they described how his disappearance was discussed at a village well, how soldiers searched for his tracks in the forest, and how a woman saw a figure near the monastery walls. All of this matched eyewitness accounts, but it was recorded as if the author were observing the events from the inside, from the very heart of them.
One of the pages read,
They are looking for him in the forest, but he is not there. They call to him at the chapel, but he does not answer. He is going another way, a way that is not visible.
This phrase became key.
Another way, what did it mean? An underground passage? A secret corridor? Or a metaphor that couldn't be translated into fact? The entries continued. They included names of people the general couldn't have known. Dates were mentioned that coincided with nights when soldiers heard footsteps or whistles. It was as if the diary were recording not the events themselves, but their shadows, their reflections. Particularly disturbing was a recording made several months after his disappearance. He returns in the fog, standing by the wall, looking at the door, but the door is not for everyone. Who wrote these lines? Why did they end up in the monastery wall next to his case? There were no answers. But the discovery became a new starting point. Now the general's disappearance was no longer just a mystery of the past. It became part of the present, part of a legend that continued to live and grow. On the last page of the notebook was a short phrase, "He is waiting." These two words dashed all attempts to put an end to it. Because if he was waiting, then the story wasn't over. It meant that disappearance wasn't an end, but a transition. Since then, the monastery has become a place of pilgrimage not only for believers, but also for those seeking answers. People would come to the wall where the notebook was found and place their palms on the stone, hoping to feel the breath of someone who had gone the other way. And every time, on foggy evenings, a shadow appeared near the walls. No one asked, "Who is it?" Everyone knew that the answer had long been written down in the notebook. Time can smooth out rough edges, but it cannot erase voids. The general's disappearance became precisely such a void. It was left unfilled by reports, searches, or recovered items. It remained a gaping hole in memory, and a legend gradually grew around it. At first, these were cautious words. He took a different road, the elders said, without specifying what exactly they meant. For some, this road was a secret passage beneath the monastery. For others, a metaphor signifying a passage into a world without witnesses. But the more years passed, the more confident these words sounded. In the village, they said that on foggy evenings, a uniformed figure could be seen near the monastery walls. It stood motionless, as if waiting. Sometimes it seemed to hold a cane, sometimes a glove case. No one came close. Those who tried said the figure vanished like smoke. The diary found in the wall became part of this legend. Its pages were memorized almost by heart. He hasn't left. He's waiting. This phrase became a kind of incantation, repeated in whispers. Some believed the general was waiting to return to his world. Others, that he was waiting for those who could walk the same path. The monastery became a place of pilgrimage. People came there not only to pray, but also to touch the mystery. They placed their palms on the wall, where the case and notebook had been found, and listened. Some claimed to hear footsteps behind the stone. Others, a soft whistle, similar to the melody the general liked to whistle. Rumors multiplied. It was said that on certain nights, the scent of the polish he used to polish his cane could be smelled in the corridors of the long-abandoned headquarters. In the village, they claimed that small objects, a button, a pin, a piece of paper, were sometimes found on the road leading to the hill. They were taken for signs left by him. But the most astonishing thing was that the legend didn't evoke fear. It wasn't the story of a ghost or a curse. It was the story of a man who didn't disappear, but remained in his own way, in his own place. His absence became a presence of a different kind. Over the years, the general's disappearance ceased to be a mystery to be solved. It became part of the landscape, part of memory. Like a river that flows next to a village, no one asks where it goes. They simply accept it. And now, when a shadow appears near the monastery walls on foggy evenings, no one is surprised. No one asks, "Who is that?" Everyone knows it's him, the general who took a different route and stayed behind to wait. Thus the story became a legend, and the legend began to outlive life itself.